Welcome to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno. Today's guest is soccer broadcaster and analyst, Kristian Jack. KJ, thanks for being on today's episode. I'm really excited to talk footy with you, and this is just an absolute pleasure.
Matias, it's an absolute pleasure to be on with you. How are you?
I'm doing absolutely excellent. How have things been with yourself recently?
Things have been okay, man. Yeah, things are good. We're in the middle of a pandemic, so it's navigating through that. But never a dull moment, and there's never a day goes by without a soccer game on. So it's always an opportunity to watch something else and learn more and enjoy it.
Absolutely. And even today, one of the games that really caught my eye was North Macedonia stunning Germany 2-1 in World Cup qualifiers. They're one of the teams I think that's a bit interesting in that group, considering that Germany looks to have it on lock. But some of the smaller European nations, I think, are starting to really make noise, especially going into Euro 2020, or I guess 2021, I should say. It's so fascinating to see how much the football world has evolved in the last 10 years, specifically in regards to the Euro.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're used to now in the professional game this hierarchy, right? Where I guess sports will always kind of get gear this where you got the giants and you've got the underdogs, and rarely do you have those kind of moments, and particularly in the era of we're in with money, and in the club game, the big teams will often rule as the minnows. But what we're finding in the middle of a pandemic is that sport's becoming even more unpredictable, which is great again, a little bit. So it's coming into the international sport as well. Of course, you're always going to have Denmark or Belgium thumping some of the minnows that we've seen already in World Cup qualifying over the last few days. But yeah, the North Macedonia-Germany game was an interesting result. And look, Germany are going through a difficult time right now. Their coach is obviously leaving after the Euros, and he's in charge of kind of getting them to the World Cup. It's kind of this hybrid moment, so it's really unusual to see coaches kind of coaching this World Cup phase, but then not being involved in the World Cup. So it's an opportunity for more kind of knockouts. And as you said, North Macedonia are in the Euros as well. So it's great that they go out there and do that and have a result like that they can celebrate. That's what I think the sports are all about. It's the unscripted drama at its finest.
Even the other day, I know Portugal played Luxembourg and they were losing 1-0 at one point, and I was like, what? And I know before the game, Fernando Santos had said, don't sleep on Luxembourg. They're one of the teams that has improved the most. And I thought he was saying that, because they're trying to be nice and they're not trying to be arrogant or boastful. But Luxembourg didn't really play that poorly. I mean, they didn't get the result they wanted, obviously. But at the end of the day, 3-1 loss to Portugal at home is no small feat for the micronation that really has suffered some seriously ugly defeats in the past.
Yeah, it's narrowing the gap a little bit, and I think that's important that the international game can do that. And as you said, they've definitely improved. We're getting to see these teams particularly at the top end of the level. Like obviously, some Portugal players have been playing the world-class players at the level, playing so many games, and you can try and take advantage of that with the fatigue level as well of these players. Again, in this international window, that most of these teams are playing 3 games just to squeeze it all in the calendar, when very often they'd only play 2, and they're coming off a club campaign where some of these players are already getting close to 50 games already since they've only been playing since September. So there's opportunities there that you can take advantage of. And as I said, I think you've got a Portugal allegiance, don't you? So maybe you're a little nervous there. But for those of us who didn't, any kind of fun result like that is a good one to watch.
I want to touch a little bit on this more because I found it so fascinating watching from a distance and starting to get a closer look really at how Portugal has been doing. And now obviously having Portuguese heritage and an allegiance to the team will always create some element of homer bias, but I've kind of been confused as to exactly how well they've really been doing in the scope of Europe, because I know that you mentioned there's so many of their players now, maybe guys that weren't at Euro 2016 or weren't really starters at the World Cup, that have been playing at a world-class level across Europe and England. I know there's a few players from Manchester City as well. Ronaldo has been in top form, but talk about what you've seen from Portugal and how they've really evolved in the last year or so, because they won the UEFA Nations League, which at this point for football fans seems kind of like a made-up tournament in this moment because it hasn't established a history. But what have you seen from some of their guys on their starting 11 and how their odds may fare at the Euro this summer?
Well, I mean, first of all, I remember doing the Euros in 2016 for TSM when they won. And I felt at that time that the team that was coming was going to be better. Now, that doesn't mean this team's going to win, but it still means that they can be better over long periods of time. I think that's a very exciting time to be a Portuguese fan. I think you've got a good nucleus of players where you've got the ending generation, shall we call it. I think of, Font and Pepe and Ronaldo. And I think of like a middle generation where you think of the players who are on the other side of potentially, and by the way, you can throw João Moutinho in there as well on the other one. I think of those in the middle there where you don't think of them really as the youth players anymore. And then obviously, you've got Bruno Fernandes, Bernardo Silva, João Cancelo, 25, 26, 27 players like that. And then you've got the youth, the young players coming in, João Felix and Neto from Wolves, and Jota still quite young as well. And, Andre Silva, I'm not quite sure what he's going to become. But my point in all of this is I think it's just really exciting time, a really exciting time for Portugal. I think the group is one of the most fascinating groups in the history of the game. When you look at major competitions that have happened in the past, we've got the current winners in Portugal, the current World Cup winners in France, the last World Cup winners in Germany. So the last three teams to win major competitions all in the same group. And I think those that will survive the group, it can help because I think that it can be exhausting having to play two of those teams. Particularly if you're Portugal or you're France, playing Germany away is not going to be easy because it isn't traditionally an away game. But I think that if you can survive that, knowing that you're not going to win every game and you don't need to in a tournament where 16 teams are going to get through, then I think that you'll find that the opposition will become a little bit easier and you'll feel a little bit more battle hardened going into the knockout stage of the competition.
And even when I reflect back on Euro 2012, you mentioned how the team that was going to succeed, the 2016 team, was even going to be better. And I had my doubts about the 2016 team, as I'm sure many football fans did and still do, putting an asterisk or, they didn't win these games, or they made it to this knockout stage similar to Italy in 1982 when they drew their games and went through, and that next thing you know, they won the World Cup, and that's all that people are going to remember. But in 2012, that was also a group of death there as well, because Denmark was not that poor. They were actually doing pretty good. Netherlands were there, Germany and Portugal. Four really good. I mean, Denmark maybe being the weakest of the bunch, but they still had a good showing considering they're up against three monsters in 2012. And the way that group played out was so unpredictable because you'd think that, maybe Portugal is going to fall to Netherlands, but Netherlands had their disappointments. So this group you mentioned going to be one of the most interesting in tournament history. And I don't know what more could be done to eclipse the I guess the magnitude of that group on paper, because you look at three major tournament winners that all went back to back to back.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
Like, it's going to be so crazy. And especially with how France has been in top form and Germany, they've had a bit of their struggles, but again, I think they're one of the most consistent teams to have ever played football. Now, what I mean by that is if you look at their record minus the blip in 2018, since 1974, Germany have failed to reach the semifinals, I think only 3 times.
Right.
And they've been so consistent in the World Cup era with the new trophy that they're a team that can never be slept on, no matter what. And until they go into a rut, I think that they will always be one of the favorite teams in the Euro.
Yeah, and as I said, playing their games in Munich is a big advantage, and the thing for Portugal is that, and I remember doing the games for TSN as well in the playoffs for that tournament. Hungary are there too, and they're a home team. So I think Portugal played 2 away games first in Budapest and then Munich before finishing with France. So you think about it, it's hard enough as it is to be in a group like that in a neutral environment. Imagine having to do that with 2 away games in effect as well. Now, we don't know as of time of recording when those games are going to be for sure in those stadiums. If fans are going to be involved, we don't know. But still, it's still going to feel more like home for the other team than them. So, but I do think I agree with you about the Germany thing, but I don't think they've got that intimidation factor anymore. I don't think they intimidate Portugal. They shouldn't. But as you said, they have a wonderful record. They are tournament sassy. They know how to make a way through a tournament. And I don't think anybody would be betting the fact that they could get knocked out of the group, particularly games at home, and you can get through the group with 3 teams as well.
And I think one of the last times that Portugal showed they had no fear of Germany was back in Euro 2000. I remember doing a little bit of research on that tournament, and you look and see in Portugal, honestly, of all the tournaments that Portugal has never won and come close, I think Euro 2000 probably has to be the one that people should remember more. People always think of Euro 2004, as they
Right.
should. But Euro 2000, they were a really, really strong team. And that was when the generation that Figo played in was really in its prime, because they were amongst the same group that played and won the Under-20 World Cup back in 89 when they beat Brazil. And that was in Portugal. And then in Euro 2000, they beat Germany in the group 3-0. And I don't think Germany made it out of the group that year. And again,
It
they were
didn't,
playing
no.
England. They were down 2-0. And next thing you know, they came back, and England's squad wasn't that weak either. And they only lost, I think it was in golden goal or silver goal, one of the two. They lost to France in the semifinal, and that was a really strong team. So Germany was not that great then, but again, this is definitely maybe a bit of a change. Like you said, there's not that much of an intimidation factor as there was maybe in 2014, and especially since their disaster in 2018, I think teams are a little more calm with Germany. But again, you're right, they can sashay their way through a tournament, and they're definitely a team that can use their really strong tactics, despite maybe not having as high of a level of talent as they have in the past, to be
Right.
able to make some surprises.
Yeah, no, I think as you said, they'll find a way through. But as I said, Portugal should look at it as being an opportunity because they get to play big teams. And look, nobody wants to lose the games in the group stages and get sent home because that would be a disaster. I think Portugal need to look at it in two different facets. To me, is that there are three groups, three games, but the two away games before they play France, if they can get 4 points from those two games, they'll be in. And that's maybe sounds like a bit of an ask, but if you think about it, they should technically get 4 points. I think they're good enough to get 4 points from, despite playing away games against Hungary and Germany. I just don't think you need to be going into that France game on 2 points, for example, or 1 point, or even 3 points, with the fact that you could lose the game and get knocked out. You don't want that.
Absolutely. Now, to take things over a little bit to your backyard, England had one of their best showings in recent history at the 2018 World Cup, having made the semifinals and finished, although they finished in fourth place, still had a fantastic run to the semis with the unfortunate loss of Croatia. Talk a bit about what you think their chances are at Euro 2021 and if they can continue to rise from the performance they had in 2018.
Yeah, I think they'll be okay in the group. I think the group is it's not ideal, but it's a Croatian team that is in the significant decline. That I think, particularly looking at their group, even though it's not a difficult group for World Cup, I think they may find it difficult to be in the next World Cup. And we all know that they've had a wonderful run, and with the legends of the game that have played for them, in particular the magician Madrid. But I would say I think they'll be okay in the group. The Czechs are not a great team. Scotland is it's just a disaster draw for England. It's a non-winnable game. If they win, everyone says you should win. If they don't win, it's a disaster because you can't beat the Scots. So it's the worst case scenario for an Englishman. But I do think, to answer your question, they'll be fine to get out of the group. After that, I don't have a lot of confidence. I don't think that they've shown truly that if they play an elite team in a knockout level of football, not on home soil, that they can win. They may prove me wrong, but as of right now, that's the way I feel. Now, if they can somehow get through the round of 16 and the quarterfinal to suddenly be football's coming home back at Wembley and play a semi-final in front of their nation, even if their fans are not there or sporadically around the stadium, look out, they've got a chance. But I just think one of those round of 16 or quarterfinal hurdles will probably be their undoing.
So I want to take a bit of a transition and ask you, as a fan of England, what is the most memorable tournament you have ever witnessed them play?
It has to be 1990 World Cup, because everybody has a World Cup. You and I were talking before we came on the air about our memories, and everybody has one World Cup that will always be their World Cup, and then every other World Cup after it is great and it's gravy, but it never ever becomes the same World Cup as that one World Cup. Now, it's not my first World Cup memory, because I remember 1986. I remember where I was watching the final at my granddad's house, 8 years old. but I don't truly remember a lot of the tournament. I remember the Maradona handball and the big furore in England and the just general resentment and absolute despise of this man at the time for cheating a nation, as they said. But 1990 is the World Cup for me. 12 years old. Remember every game, what it meant to us. England had a struggle through the group stages, but then again, what that can mean as a country when you start seeing your team get closer and closer and get to a semi-final, it just captivated the entire nation. And I sometimes find myself, and we've all been there, going down what I call sporting rabbit holes on YouTube, and you go, what you're looking up next, and nothing gets me more. Well, very, very few things make me happier in this sport than typing in Italian 90 highlights and BBC review of it, and the great Des Lynam at BBC presenting the Christmas review show of the 1990 tournament. Was he in the foggy San Siro? It's wonderful. It brings back almost tears to your eyes to think about what that tournament will be. And I just truly hope everybody can understand when I say everyone has that World Cup, that you have to be at that age as you see it through the eyes of a young boy, and everything else after that is special, but nothing like that.
100%. And honestly, I think you put it in such perfect words, because immediately when you said that World Cup, as a young boy, first thought in my head was 2006, because like I said to you before we started recording, there will never be a World Cup in my mind. Obviously, if Brazil or Portugal win, that will be more special in terms of seeing the result that you wish to happen. But at the same time, there's something so iconic about that life-changing, magical tournament. You watch it, you remember the games. I remember being at school and coming on the weekend watching the Portugal-England game. I remember the shootout and going crazy and then being sad and then going crazy again. And the absolute devastation I felt seeing France beat not only Brazil and Portugal, and thinking,
right,
years later, I was like, wow, if Brazil would have won that game, Brazil would have played Portugal in the semifinal of the World Cup in 2006, and my childhood soccer mind would have exploded into a billion pieces. But we always remember I remember where I was at my friend's birthday party watching the final and Zidane's red card and the shockwaves that sent through the football world. But I think there's always really memorable things that come from each tournament. But you're right, there's nothing like that first one that gets you hooked, because then once it gets you hooked, then you're on it for life. And as you can see with everything you've done in your career and up to this point, I think that 1990 definitely played a very vital role in just being a catalyst for your extreme passion for football.
Yeah, thanks, man. It certainly did. And, like David Platt scored a goal in the 120th minute of a game against Belgium in the last 16 to win 1-0. And, David Platt played for my team, Aston Villa, at the time. And it was like when he scored that goal, it was like, he's scoring for us, and that was like, you grow up in the northwest of England and surrounded by Liverpool fans and Manchester United fans and, very few Villa fans. And when Platt scored that goal, it was like one of us too. That just made it even more special for me. So, forever remember that tournament. And it certainly helped that England went far. And, as a fan, that was special. You kind of always kind of look for England as a fan now, but I'll be lying if I said that it was anything like that. When we did the 2018 World Cup on TSN, with every game, 200 hours of live television. Of course, you want England to do well, but you're a broadcast professional at that point. You genuinely are. You support them and you want them to do well, but I never allowed it to ever affect how I would look at the game, and result and give the same kind of analysis and focus on the team that I'm playing, just because you were aware of the great thing about this country is that so many people are from so many different countries, and that's what they deserve.
100%. And it's interesting you mentioned how your perspective on that changes as a professional broadcaster. On the previous episode of the show, we had James Duthie on, and he was talking about hockey moments.
One of my favorites.
Being from Ottawa. And one of the things he said that's exactly the same as what you just said is your perspective changes once it's your profession, and you almost lose a bit of the magic of the fandom, whether that's a blessing or a curse or a bit of both. And when you're on the panel, when you're doing analysis, you got to give credit where credit is due. And you also have to point out their mistakes where they make mistakes. And you can't let your intrinsic love for the team affect any analysis you give, because like you said, there's so many people that live from all different backgrounds and nations in Canada that deserve that accurate educational analysis. And especially with the wonderful job you guys did on the panel for all major tournaments that we watched on TSN, it really shows that the fans become more and more captivated each tournament, and not letting that bias influence your work is definitely helpful. But at the same time, watching England do well is always a nice feeling. So then I want to ask, is it different watching games in person versus when you watch on television within your job, or how do you look at the way you consume games now from a broadcaster perspective?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you watch games very differently as a broadcaster. And if you can watch them in stadium and watch them in person, it's far different to watching on television. You can just generate different opinions about players, and you know, I don't know how differently I watch the games to other people. But I know that when other people have watched games to me, they've said you don't watch the game like I watch the game. So I don't tend to follow the ball. I don't tend to look at things like that all the time. I look at other things and across the field and the systems they're playing in different positions and what they do. So you can get a better grasp of that. I'd say it's in a stadium environment on a live area. So I think you can learn a tremendous amount from watching players, and I think we're still seeing that, trying to navigate that into the professional game over here in Major League Soccer, where they have to, we're looking at scouting players and understanding it. And do you want to sign players based off scouting clips and sites that you subscribe to, or do you want to go watch these players live? And I think that's so important that, you sounds like you'd think that they would go watch them live, but there's been many players that have been signed for a lot of investment and a lot of time that haven't actually been seen live. So for me, it's always live every time.
What really made you keen on doing football analysis, and how did you learn to navigate your way from where you began to where you've gotten now? What were some of the major things that contributed to that?
Well, I always just wanted to cover sports. I was a sports nut as a child. My son's the same now. I just loved it. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do in terms of what sport it would be, but I knew pretty early that I wasn't going to make it as a professional player, whether it be as a soccer or cricket. I was very good at cricket, but I wasn't a professional level of cricket, rugby, whatever it would be. So I love to write. I love writing, and I have a passion for storytelling. And so very quickly, when I would have like English assignments, I would combine sports and writing, and I was like, this is fun. This is way better than writing about the news. I thought, this, if I could make a living out of this, I'd love to do that. So I kind of followed that passion, media study, training, photography, radio, TV, all of that, did that, journalism in university, worked in newspapers, couldn't get into sports right away because everybody wants to do it. Worked in news for a while, and it almost killed my passion because it was so depressing. And eventually got into sports, covered football and all the other things in newspapers for 2 or 3 years. And then really TV kind of found me, because when I moved here, I wanted to carry on that industry, and newspapers were very different over here than they are in the UK, and couldn't really get a break. And then I got an internship at the Score Television Network back in 2003 and worked there for a decade and did a lot of things behind the scenes on lots of different sports, because I felt my passion was there for lots of them. And then eventually we did a show called Sports World that was covering lots of different sports around the world, that navigated, eventually transitioned into the footy show. So it was 100% soccer, which I produced and eventually appeared on, and then eventually co-hosted with James. And we did the World Cup Tonight in 2010. So it was all a kind of a natural process going forward. I think at the time, looking back, that it was at a time when the game was growing tremendously in this country. Youngsters like yourself were falling in love with the game, and the next generation of people from different countries that have come to Canada. And what I found pretty quickly was there was an incredible passion for the sport in this country, and an incredible knowledgeable fan base of people who needed to have a high-end conversations that I personally didn't think necessarily were happening enough.
So a little more on that in particular, in terms of the growing love of football in Canada. Obviously, there's a lot of factors that contribute to that, but what do you think are some of the main ones that have caused for the injection of passion of, the football fever in Canada, and where do you see it continuing to grow in the future? Because it's definitely soared since you came to Canada, an enormous amount.
It's sort of an enormous amount because a lot of it is access. At that time, we don't necessarily have as much access now, but we certainly had on television access to lots of different live games that previous generations of people in Canada didn't have. I've heard stories of people waiting a week to find out they can watch a game, and then finding a week later they're watching a Manchester United game that happened the week before on tape delay. And then now, loads of people got access to games live, which was fantastic. I actually think, I think you said you're 24. So I think your generation deserves a tremendous amount of credit. When I moved to Canada, I was a similar age to you. I was actually younger than you at the time. And I found that people around my age at that time and people who were older than me had a lot of questions of, why did I move to Canada? What are you moving to Canada for? And I couldn't get over how quiet Canadians were in terms of what they loved, and I was like, this is a hidden gem, this country in the world, and then I think the next generation, the people that have come next, I think have played an enormous part in standing up for what they believe in and what they're proud of, and puffing their chest out and saying, yeah, we can still be Canadian and we can still be genuinely friendly and do it in the right way, but be proud of where we're from. And the whole the Sixth, the music scene and the basketball scene with the Raptors has played a big part of that. But my point being is that I think with that comes a whole generation of people who are more expressive, who can let people know what they like, and it isn't quiet and sheepish anymore. It's getting out there and it's confident in what they want to do, and then obviously they're influenced by their fathers or their mother's generation and their love for the country, from the country that they're from. And then with the access comes in it, so you put it all in the same melting pot, and I think it just has exploded, as you said.
The way that you ended that was so great, because it really made me think of back to when I was a kid in my generation. All my friends who I went to school with or played football with, we all identified so strongly with our heritage, even if because none of us were born there. We're all first generation or second generation Canadians,
Right.
but there was just this burning desire and passion for following our heritage through football. And that was, I think, the main thing, at least on my end and amongst many of my friends, that really allowed us to explore our cultural heritage. So rather than exploring our heritage and then loving football because of it, it was we love football and explored our cultural heritage because of it. So I don't really remember that being that in touch with being, my mom from Portugal or my dad from Brazil. It was because of the '06 World Cup. It was because my dad said, let's watch Brazil play, or Portugal is playing. And then all of a sudden we became so captivated by understanding more about our home nations from our parents. And so you mentioned not having access to games on television. I remember I used to have to put VHS tape in at someone else's house because it wasn't on all the major channels, just to watch a friendly, just to watch. I remember Brazil, Portugal, 2007. Like, it was like terrible grainy feed on a VHS, but
Right.
that was the way that I could watch that game.
It's not that long ago either.
And it isn't. And it meant so much. And to see what you guys did at the score with building the footy show and then having the World Cup tonight and everything, like, that really was along the apex of the curve when it started to shoot into the stratosphere. Because I did an interview through one of the websites I work for with Richard Hastings, who,
yeah,
you understand the history of Canadian football, remember, scored one of the most iconic goals in men's national team history, game winner in the Gold Cup against Mexico. And I remember asking him, I'm like, well, Canada won the Gold Cup in 2000, and it was 2000 or 2001.
2000.
2000. It was 2000. Okay. So it was 2000 and they won. And I was like, that must have, like, why did that not, why was that not the launch pad for, the Alphonso Davies and Jonathan Davids of the world coming into play? And it's like, well, different things happen. And the way that they build the youth, like the game for youth, and the way that people have access to the game really affects how fast and how quickly things can start to, I guess, or the groundwork can be laid, how fast things can really start to develop. And so it's interesting that really wasn't what launched into the stratosphere, but more so maybe almost a decade later, and now it's exploded. So where have you seen the Canadian game grow, or maybe some areas where it could be improved from the grassroots level, based on your experience having lived in Canada for about 20 years now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the connections to the national teams are really important. I think we've seen with the women's game what the 2015 Women's World Cup was able to do. And before that, 2012 Olympics, when, Christine Sinclair and the girls got the bronze. And Young girls across Canada had heroes. You want posters of these people and put them on the wall. The men's game hasn't had that yet, and what will come of that will be interesting because they need that moment. First of all, they needed credibility, and they needed success. And credibility comes from people like yourself and fans in Canada of the game that are fans of huge European clubs or big clubs in Europe, and you may be a fan of a CPL team or an MLS team, but really you love your European team. It doesn't matter who it is. And then how do you get those fans to connect with the Canadian men's national team? And previously they're like, well, I'll kind of watch it. It's Canada, but I don't know. I like Canada, but like if they were to play Portugal or Brazil, well, that's my parent. That's my team. I would want them to win. But even though I'm born in Canada, but how do you change that conversation? Well, first of all, you've got to get credibility. So Alphonso Davies and Jonathan David and players like Atiba Hutchinson and others who perform high level in Europe suddenly get credibility in the eyes of those, not necessarily snobbish soccer fans, but high level soccer fans that go, I need you to prove to me that you're worth watching. How can I connect with you? And then what comes after the credibility is success. They need to be successful. They need to have their equivalents of what the women's team had. And they need to qualify for a World Cup. And when they get to a World Cup, then the rest is history. That it will explode. And the commercial revenue will come with that. And the household names will come with that. And those of us that debate now about Alphonso Davies' stature in Canada will be like, yeah, we've been shouting about this for years. Hello, welcome, come on board. There's loads of room here. So I think that will have to come, but it's down to them now. There's a lot of excitement about that group. They've just had a good, successful World Cup qualifiers, albeit against minnows. And they've got a great group, and everybody I speak to there gets along really well. But they know that their future is going to be defined whether they're going to get into the last 8 of the qualification process to the World Cup, which will mean playing big games against the likes of Mexico, United States, Panama, Jamaica, Costa Rica, you name it.
Yeah, the hexagon, I believe that's the nickname they use for the final stage of the qualifiers in CONCACAF.
Yeah, it's the octagon this year. It's moved to 8, so they've changed it. Yes,
and that's
based on because of COVID, they've made everything different and they've changed the system. It was the hex, and now it's the octagon. So it's basically it's going to be the final 8. So they play teams home and away for 14 games.
So then will it still be the top 4 teams qualified to go to the World
Cup?
Cup?
3.5, yes. So top 3 get through, and then the 4th plays the playoff. Yeah.
The Intercontinental playoff, that's correct.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Well, I guess with the exception of this year being the octagon, then I don't think, if I'm not mistaken, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Canada's qualified for that final round since they last made the World Cup in 1986, if I'm not mistaken. Or maybe if it was one, it was...
They have done it once.
Was it 2012 when they lost to Honduras, or 2010 or something like that?
So the Honduras loss is famous, right? Because of how bad it was, right? Yeah. So that's the disaster, right? That's the big moment where everybody remembers. I was looking at the score at the time, and that was their opportunity, right? But it's funny how people look back at that moment as being how close they really were, but then it's not really considered close because of what a disaster it was, right? It's like that moment. It's like, well, were they close or were they not close because of the end result? So, but you're right. They haven't. That's part of the thing as well, Mateus, is that yes, the journey is just almost as important as the destination. Like if they get to a World Cup, people like you and I and those who love the sport, it's enormous, right? But the journey for those who don't know about it needs to be told. They need to get into that octagon to have these high level games, not only to learn how to go to these difficult countries and nurture themselves and come through turmoil and lose and win and back themselves against difficult opponents, but also for the story to gather momentum in terms of people getting on board going, yeah, come on, we want to get behind this team. Could they do it? And that's part of the allure. Getting there is fantastic, but the journey to get there is almost just as important for revenue and attention and everything.
100%. And Canada definitely has a lot of work to do in terms of qualifying for the World Cup, making it there and really establishing themselves, because once they do, you're right, Canada will be able to go to the moon in the world of football, especially within their own country. And with the birth of the CPL and with how well the women's team has done, it's time for the men's team to catch up. And I think that there's a tremendous opportunity with the talent they have now. So KJ, we're getting towards the end of our time here in today's episode, so I wanted to ask a few fun wrap-up questions just before we go, and to maybe take a trip down memory lane and start to get the gears going, thinking back to some of your even more youthful days.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, who is your favorite English player of all time?
Favorite English player of all time. It's probably going to have to be David Platt because of his connections to Villa. Although I really like Michael Carrick as a player. I think he's a very underrated player. Player that didn't play enough for England. So I'd probably go with them, which, I mean, it's not the legendary players that you probably think of, but they had connections to other clubs that I necessarily didn't have any connections with.
What's the most exciting football match you've ever watched live?
Wow. Most exciting football match I've ever watched live. What a fantastic question. There's been so many. I've been very fortunate. I think my favorite is, again, it's back to what you see as a fan when you're younger. The 1994 Coca-Cola Cup final at Wembley, League Cup final now, as you know it, was Aston Villa against Manchester United. I only got a ticket the day before, and Manchester United were going for the treble that year, and you know all the legends that were playing for that team. Villa were big time underdogs, and we beat them 3-1, and Kanchelskis got sent off, and they got absolutely outplayed. So that there's nothing like the highs of a game like that when you're a supporter and you're in the stands at Wembley and you see your team lift the trophy. That's pretty magical. There's been many others, but yeah, I'll probably go with that one.
No doubt. I can't imagine what that feeling would be like, especially to be there live in a huge underdog match. That's just absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, who is the top 3 people you've ever interviewed in the world of football? Because I know if I said one, then we might be here all day.
Top 3 in terms of favorites or fame?
Top 3 favorite people. Top 3 favorites that you interviewed, that you enjoyed interviewing the most.
Okay. In terms of world football, all right. Let me think about this. 3. Well, one of them would be Kaká. Yeah, that would be one. Even though it wasn't a long interview, I was always quite fascinated by him in terms of just his grace. And I use that word wisely because I think he's a gracious man and certainly a gracious footballer. The way that he would glide across the field with a football was pretty remarkable. The heights of his career was, I suppose, quite symbolic of a Brazilian player, that when he was at the best, he was really the best, but it wasn't necessarily at the level of consistency that you would imagine to some. And a lot of Brazilian players have been like that. You know, the elite players of Brazilian times don't necessarily stay at the top forever for lots of different reasons. Ronaldinho and the original Ronaldo certainly had longer than that, but his came from obviously a major concern with his injuries, and Ronaldinho with his behavior off the field certainly didn't help. But Kaká, for me, was a great interview. I mean, I've interviewed Rooney and Zlatan, and I mean, the Zlatan interview was great because it went. I mean, I've done that 2 or 3 times, but it was so fun because I created different things for him, like a quiz, and you always try and make them very different. These guys have been interviewed millions of times. You do, but you know, I go into it like I'm researching so much, watching movies and documentaries of them, reading books, and finding out a little bit about them. And the number one player that I enjoy the most interviewed was Bastian Schweinsteiger. Because he's just a complete legend of the game who's won everything. And when I get to speak to people like that and I can get them on a level where they're sharing things with me that they feel really comfortable with, I'm absolutely fascinated by it, because, you know, that high performance athlete, to the mentality to get to the point where they win and to grow up in the Bayern system where it's just every day is relentless to win. And also to talk to him about, yes, his successes of winning World Cups and Champions Leagues, but the failures that came with that as well. You know, I was doing a podcast recently talking about this, but, you know, everyone remembers him lifting the World Cup in 2014, but how many people remember their failure in 2010 against Spain when they lost on a 1-0 in the semi-final, when they lost to the set-piece goal by the header by Puyol, but were absolutely smashed off the field. Right, it was 1-0, but they were outplayed, and they walk off that field that day and go, if we want to win a World Cup, we need to play like them. And that's 4 years in the making. And the success that comes 4 years later is out of failure. And that's a lesson in life. Failures can lead to success. And, lifting the Champions League trophy at Wembley after beating Dortmund with Robben scoring a goal in the last minute, after he missed a penalty in the Allianz Arena in Munich on his own turf in the Champions League against Chelsea, when they battered them and Drogba scored in the last minute to get it to a penalty shootout and robbed them. Like that, again, a failure that you're never going to get over. You don't think it. He's there crying with his shirt over his eyes in the middle of Munich, and everyone's in tears. And then there he is a year later, lifting the trophy. So it's and the level of depth that he got into with me was, I guess, a little bit of a credit to me, but credit to him that he was able to share that, and I was able to ask the right questions to get that kind of information. So that was my favorite, without question.
That's so fantastic. Schweinsteiger has had such an illustrious career, and it's interesting that you mentioned the failures that he experienced have had as much of an impact, almost if not more at times, on his successes that people will remember. 2014 World Cup, and winning the Champions League in Wembley. But you're right. The first thing that jumped to mind was, I remember when Robben was taking the penalty in extra time, and when he didn't even want to look at it, because you could sense that there was that fear, there was that anxiety of what if he doesn't get it? And then Czech makes a save. And then when he steps up in the shootout, you're like, well, we know what might happen here. And then Czech gets a fingertip to it off the post and out. And then once he turns, Drogba stepping up to do what Chelsea fans have been waiting for their entire history. But the redemption, the 4 years in the making, the winning the Champions League the next season, like that's what a real champion is made of, is using those failures as leverage to get to that next level. So it's amazing that you're able to interview such an insightful footballer. The final question I have, and this is a follow-up to what we were just talking about. If there was one person, player or coach, who you have not yet had the chance to interview, who would it be and why?
Oh, okay. Wow. I think Xavi Hernandez, he's my favorite player. So I think I'd love to speak to Xavi if I could get him at the level that I got Schweinsteiger comfortable. Again, the level of intelligence from him, how he saw a game. I'd like to talk to him about what fascinates me, again, is World Cups and how you win World Cups. I'd like to talk to him about, and I've read a ton of books about this, so I know it happened, was how he got the Real Madrid and Barcelona players when their fan bases are so torn apart, how he united them together for the greater good to get them to win in 2008, 2010, and 2012. Because prior to that, Spain were perennial chokers at major tournaments. And he, in particular, Iker Casillas, were the captains and leaders, one from Barcelona and one from Real Madrid, and how they gelled them together. And I'd love to hear it from him about how he did that and how he played a part in that. And also, as I said, just to listen to some of his stories. I always tell the story. I went to the new camp in 2012 to watch Barcelona, and I'm like, I can't wait to go here. I'm going to go watch Messi play at the new camp. And of course, I enjoyed watching Messi play, but I spent the 90 minutes watching Xavi because he ran the game. And that's that's a guy that for me, will go down as one of the greatest players of all time and the greatest Spanish player of all time for me.
The thing that's so fascinating about him is that sometimes, he does get a lot of credit for what he's done, but growing up, I remember not really paying as much attention to him and how much importance he actually carried for Spain until 2010. I started to realize, wow, he's actually one of the best players in the world, and easily in Spanish history by such a wide margin. And honestly, I would think that he's one of the most underrated legends in football history, because him as a catalyst alone for Spain's success, for being that glue amongst like you said, they're perennial chokers. Like, what did they do in Euro 2004?
Yeah.
2002, obviously the South Korea scandal, can't really take that, hold that against them. But 98, right, they didn't do much, right? So like, Spain didn't really do anything in the World Cup ever. They made the semifinals in 1950, but that was just the final pool, which doesn't really count. So they didn't really do anything, right? Like,
no, exactly. Yeah.
and
And that's it. That fascinates me. And the other one is not so much Xavi, but with Fabregas, because the Fabregas penalty that he scored against Italy in the 2008 Euros, he was 21 years old. He was the fifth taker in that penalty shootout. And they missed penalty shootouts all the time. They lost penalty shootouts all the time, and they changed history with that kick. And that's because very rarely do you look at a country's destination, their journey being changed by one moment, but that was defined by that penalty by Cesc Fabregas, and that's for me another great thing. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of the history of that team. I got a lot of soft spots for that team because particularly covering 08, 10, and 12 as I did, and getting so close to not the team, but close to that tournament when they were so good. It was really special to watch.
I do remember actually one of the episodes of the Footy Show was, I believe, way back in the day, you and James were talking about, is the late 2000s, early 2010 Spain team better than the 1970s Brazil team? And that was one of the questions I still remember of all the episodes. I still remember that one particularly. It was quite fascinating to even think back when you mentioned that moment. I'm like, man, I remember sitting there watching James Starman in the morning and saying, the next day after you get home from school and saying, oh, is 2012 Spain what they've done? Have they proved to be better than the 1970s Brazil? And I was like, have they? And it was just a great question posed. And I mean, your fascination with it definitely is a testament to how much depth you guys went into with understanding how great that team was and some of the players that played key moments. And you mentioned it's just a penalty, but it really sent shockwaves through what became, I guess, a dynasty for Spain, winning 3 major tournaments in a row.
Yeah, a dynasty. And you know what? They also danced with the devil so many times. They danced on the line of success and failure that this great game can provide. And that's the other thing, too, is that there were some teams that win and become legends and become great by their sheer dominance. And Brazil 70 certainly has that. There were moments in all of those tournaments, not necessarily 08, but certainly in 08 because of the penalty that I mentioned. There's moments where very easily it could have gone the other way, very easily in those moments. In 2010, everyone remembers their loss to Switzerland and they had to generate and then come back from that. 2012, in the last group game, they almost lost the game and they could have got knocked out. It was such a close game. They would obviously, so many of their wins were 1-0, 1-0. And that also, I think, for me, doesn't disregard their greatness. It strengthens it because they were in control even when you didn't know they were in control. They were defensive masterclasses. We are still being brilliant with the ball, and they were able to control the flow of the game. And even when it looked like they were up against the ropes, they were like a true heavyweight and they can come back out and fight and knock you down.
Well, for the listener out there, Spain had one of the greatest dynasties that the football world has ever seen. And who knows who the next nation will be that will copy or even be able to slightly replicate Spain's success. But with that, KJ, I want to thank you for having been on today's episode so much. It was an immense pleasure talking football from Canada, Europe, all over. It was super, super fun to really dive into the beautiful game with you.
It's been super fun, Mateus. I really enjoy it. Big fan of your work. Keep it up. You have some great questions. You have great content. And I know how much you love the game. That passion's there as well. You can tell. So keep that up as well. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you having me on.
Well, thank you for listening to today's episode with sports broadcaster for football and analyst, Kristian Jack.